Hello, comrades. So it's October, so we've been talking a lot about some horror books, but I think it'd be cool because it's also the end of Hispanic Heritage Month if we talk some about books written in Spanish from Latin America. So I think, a lot of people do have this idea that it's good to kind of expand horizon and read books from other places, maybe translated from other languages. Those you have studied some Spanish in Spanish itself. But I think it can be a little hard to know where to start. So if that is you, if you're just kind of curious, these are just some books I think you might like. First up, we have Como agua para chocolate, like water for chocolate. And so I think this is probably the most famous, the biggest book of the ones I wanted to recommend. And honestly, at first, I wasn't a huge fan, but it's kind of grown on me. And I really I keep on coming back to it because of its themes, its language. I really like how it uses a lot of language. It's not that hard. So if you want to read a book in Spanish, it's a good place to start. It uses a lot of Mexican language, a lot of cooking language. You might have to get used to, and some kind of more metaphorical language, but the grammar and the vocabulary in general is not too complicated. And I always think of that title, like water for chocolate. And I always go, what does that mean? There's an answer to this. So in Mexico, chocolate was traditionally a drink, and so you melt it down, you put it into a drink, and to do that, you have to boil it in water. So to be like water for chocolate is to be boiling, to be overfilled with emotions. And there are a lot of really kind of beautiful phrases and things like that. So the book itself is about a woman in a family with a tradition that one of the daughters has to take care of their mother in old age and can't go on to have a husband and children. And understandably, she's not okay with this. She falls in love with someone. She wants to go out and live her life, and she doesn't want to be held back by this tradition. It's also about magic, so it's magical realism, which, if you don't know, is a genre very common in Latin America. It's kind of fantasy, but the magical aspects are seen as kind of extensions of everyday reality. It doesn't really break apart of like, yes, I'm a wizard. It's more of just a thing that happens to be magic. And so in this book, the magic is expressed through cooking, through the daughter's cooking. And I think this is really interesting because so much of the book is about this familial tradition, it's about the tradition of cooking, it's about the Mexican Revolution, it's in the background. And so there's this tug and pull about tradition and whether you want to maintain tradition or go in a completely new way. I think that's really important because it is something that comes up so often with food specifically, where we have these like familial recipes that are handed down to us because that's how it made sense to cook at the time, and you want to kind of continue that, but it also might not necessarily be the thing that works best for you, and so we do end up changing these traditions, adapting them to a new environment, and this happens a lot with like immigrant families. So people come over from like Italy, they have Italian cooking in the United States or Brazil or wherever, and they kind of adapt their cooking to their surroundings. And then you get Italian American cooking, which is diverged from the original Italian cooking. And then also in Italy, there's like the same process. I don't know, I'm using Italy as the example. And, we have the same thing with Mexican cuisine. In any cuisine, there's always this tug and pull between innovation and tradition. And I just thought this was a really interesting framework to explore this. Next up is actually a play by Mario Benedetti. It's an Uruguayan play. If you don't know anything about Uruguay, you'd be forgiven. It's really small, but it's kind of a giant among the small countries. I think it has like the most World Cup wins by per capita. There are a lot of famous authors who come from Uruguay. So it's a teeny country, but has a big impact in the culture. And like a lot of Latin American countries in the 70s, it was ran by a CIA-backed right-wing dictatorship. And so the author, Mario Benedetti, I think he was in exile when he wrote this. He was not in good graces with the Uruguayan government. And that's what this play is about. So the entire play is just this really long interrogation. It's spread out over multiple days between a political prisoner and a member of the right-wing dictatorship of the authoritarian government. And it's kind of about the strength you find in opposition and the inhumanity of authoritarianism, and it's really interesting. And I would highly recommend you read it. I'm sure you're in a good headspace when you read it. It can be a little a little strong, a little intense, a little depressing, but it's an important book and it's a really interesting book. Next up, we have Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo. This is another Mexican book. It's kind of a foundational piece in magical realism, and it's about someone whose mother dies, and on her deathbed, the son promises to her that he's going to go talk to his father. And so he has to go to another town, and he discovers a town filled with ghosts, and so he has to wander around, figure out who the ghosts are, figure out whose father is, not just like in the literal sense of who he is, but like what kind of a person he was and how he interacted with the town and everything. I think it's really kind of connected to a lot of traditional Mexican ways of thinking about death and the dead. So it's a great read for Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Dead, which is coming up this every November, and it was also really influential in the genre of magical realism. That is a question I've seen some people ask, is like, oh, why did magical realism appear in Latin America? I think a lot of it has to do with this book in particular and kind of traditional ways of viewing things, of talking about stories, and it's this kind of blend of a more kind of conventional Mexican way of viewing things and European storytelling, and it's a wonderful blend. It's a great book. It's super interesting. It was a huge influence on Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's probably the most famous of the magical realist authors. So we're gonna change the genres a bit. Next up, we have Me llamo Rigoberto Menchú y así me nació la conciencia. The literal translation is My name is Rigoberto Menchú, and this is how my consciousness was born. I think the English translation is something like I Rigoberta Menchú, but it's a biography. It's an autobiography or memoir, and so it's written by this Mayan activist woman. So once again, this will become a theme. In Guatemala at the time, there was a right-wing authoritarian dictatorship backed by the CIA, and Guatemala has a really high indigenous population, specifically of Mayan people. I know a lot of people tend to think of Mayan civilizations like this ancient thing, and they built pyramids and had hieroglyphics, and then they all died out. That's not true. They're just still there. They're about 10% of Guatemala speaks a Mayan language. I think there's something like 20 Mayan languages. It's more than 20. Maybe it's like 25 in Guatemala, and there are a few in the south of Mexico. And so she was growing up during the Civil War in Guatemala, and what's called the Mayan Genocide or the Silent Holocaust, where they were doing horrible war crimes against the Mayan population. And she was an activist. She tried to fight against this, and she was exiled to Mexico. And she continued her work. She wrote this book, and she also later won the Nobel Peace Prize. And so it's a super interesting read. It's great to learn about culture, about activism, about some of the more internal political struggles within Latin America. And she just seems like a really interesting and fantastic person. We're gonna change gears again. We have Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina. It's the open veins of Latin America. I think it's just called Open Veins of Latin America. There's no definite article in the English translation. It's by Eduardo Galeano. He's another Uruguayan author. So this is a history of colonization in Latin America. And so I think at some point in the past, 10, maybe 15 years, we've started using the term the global south. And I think some people think it's a little silly to talk about the global south. You look at a map of the world, it really doesn't make sense. Like, you look at Australia, like, Australia is part of the global north, but it's in the southern hemisphere, so it's not a great way of dividing up the entire world. But he's really, Eduardo Galeano was a writer in the 70s who's just writing mostly about Latin America, and I think it really does make a sense to talk about the north and the south. In that context, I think he was one of the first people to do so, where she's talking about European colonization of Africa, a little bit Africa, mostly Latin America. So he talks about the conquistadors in Mexico, he talks about what they did in Peru, he talks about all of that. So he goes on and talks about American expansionism, American colonialism. So we have things like the term banana republic in English. I think a lot of people say banana republic and they have some idea that it's a flimsy government that doesn't really do anything. Things are crazy, things don't work well. But I think a lot of people really kind of lose the etymology of where that came from. So if you go to the grocery store, you look at the bananas, you're gonna see Chiquita Banana, which used to be the United Food Company, and it's basically like a fruit supplier. And they ran countries. They toppled governments. They had coups. They were in charge of things with a lot of heavy backing from the CIA. It was a big part of a lot of kind of 20th century and earlier American colonialism. It's similar to kind of how we colonized Hawaii, except we didn't go the extra step to make a lot of the Central American countries where we did this, like Guatemala, like Honduras, we didn't make them territories. We just let a fruit company dictate who could be their leaders. And so he talks a lot about the exploitation, the natural resources of the people, how even things like using sugar for the Spanish destroyed the natural habitat, and how kind of Latin America is very unified through this exploitation, through this colonialism. And it's super interesting. I recommend that everyone read it. Next up, completely changing gears again, on the complete end of the political spectrum, we have Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges. It's not a political book, but the man himself was. I mean, everyone is. And so this is a short story collection, and it's more magical realism. I really love magical realism. And every story is super interesting. It's about a concept that you read it and just it sticks with you. He has one where there's an infinite library of books that are all kind of random, and so there are librarians in this infinite library just searching through the books, the random books, looking for the truth. There's one about someone who falls off a horse and loses his ability to forget. And whenever I read one of his stories, particularly in this collection, but in any of his stories that I've read so far, there's so much to think about and really kind of ponder. It's always been a great read, and I consider him one of my favorite authors. Next up, we have my all-time favorite book in any language, El Reino de este Mundo, The Kingdom of This World by Alejo Carpentier. So he was a Cuban author, but this book is about the Haitian Revolution, and it's one of the foundational books of magical realism. Alejo Carpentier didn't like magical realism specifically. He referred to Lo Real Maravilloso, which is like the real marvelous. And so for him, he wanted to make those kind of magical aspects, which a lot of times are more metaphorical, and to a reality of the story. Because it's about the Haitian Revolution, voodoo plays a really big role in this book, and it's seen as, it's depicted as like literally real, as part of how the revolution happens. And so you get a lot of contrasting ideas about how reality works and what's going on, which has this really interesting kind of cultural lens where, some people will see it one way and another person within the book will see it another way. It's really fascinating. It's a beautiful book, and it's one of those books I would recommend to everyone. So I don't want to leave you with the impression like these books cover the entirety of like Latin American literature, and there's so much I left out. I didn't talk about Isabel Allende. I didn't talk about Ernesto Sabato. I didn't talk about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I didn't talk about the guy in Peru who I think won a Nobel Prize in literature, who I don't remember the name of. There's just so much great literature to read from Latin America. So if you haven't read anything from Latin America, I would highly encourage you to do so. It's always wonderful, and there are just so many great books to read, and it is still Hispanic Heritage Month. So if you're looking for an excuse, I would say go for it. Choose one of these, or completely ignore me. Go for another one. You won't regret it. If you're interested in reading one of these books because you saw this video, drop me a like. And if you'd like to talk more about reading, you can click over here. But remember, good day, good night, good potato.